What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of the Muscle Memoirs Podcast. We have a very special episode for you today. It's not the hero nutrition Twitter wants, it's the hero it needs. Nick Hiebert, everyone. Did I pronounce your last name correctly?
Yep, and you're one of the only people that I've encountered that has done so. Yeah, it's Nick Hiebert.
Fantastic. I thought I remembered from last time. And speaking of last time, Nick was he was one of the first guests on the show. We've evolved a lot since then. It's been about 70 episodes since the last time Nick was on. But for those who might not have already listened to the episode, if you did, I appreciate you. You're a day one listener, and that means a lot to us. But for those who might not be familiar with you, Nick, can you give us a little bit of background about yourself and what you're up to these days?
Yeah, sure. So I guess my background going pretty far back, about 10 years ago, I took human nutritional science in university, although I wasn't able to finish the degree because of financial constraints. But I still continued to learn about nutrition. I still kept all my nutrition textbooks and just read them on my own time. Right now, I'm pretty much like deeply entrenched in social media and trying to course correct misconceptions about diet and nutrition whenever I encounter them. So I'll be engaged in conversations about sugar, saturated fats, animal foods versus plant foods, all sorts of discussions like this I find myself kind of entangled in. And my aim at the end of the day, I actually just thought about this yesterday. My aim at the end of the day is just trying to keep people from being afraid of food. Like, that is one of the most common underlying threads that I've noticed with a lot of people who hold dogmatic beliefs about food, is that they're just afraid of it. Like, vegans will be actually legitimately afraid of animal foods, or like regardless of the ethical implications, they'll actually be legitimately afraid of consuming them. And people on the carnivore side of the spectrum will be literally afraid of putting a piece of lettuce in their mouth. And people in the low carb camp who are of the Lustig persuasion will actually be afraid of getting a fructose molecule in their mouth, and it's just, I don't want people to have that sort of pathological relationship with food. So trying to course correct a lot of the dogma out there is really my primary goal. And the primary goal there is to just get people to just not be afraid of food when it's unwarranted.
And you're doing an absolutely fantastic job of that, Nick. I gotta say, following you on Twitter, the work you're doing, interacting with the people, referencing good science on the topic, not some suspicious blog article from Lord knows who about why seed oils are the devil and are going to wreck every aspect of your metabolism and ultimately lead to either cardiovascular disease and perhaps in combination with type 2 diabetes, which brings us to our first topic of discussion here. And that is this fascination nowadays with demonizing seed oils or vegetable oils. Specifically, the ones I see most brought up tend to be like canola oil or soybean oil. And it's an interesting space because, to be completely honest with you, with my background as a dietitian, before being exposed to nutrition Twitter, getting in the weeds, seeing all of the battles that are taking place on your side every day, I didn't know this was a topic of debate. I've written about it. I've looked into the research. I'm not sure where all of these ideas stem from, where seed oils are just the absolute worst thing you could possibly consume. And with that being said, I think some of the listeners could be confused as well. They might be like, this is a heated topic of debate. Like, what's the issue with seed oils? So I think to start, it might be a good idea to steel man this argument, right? Like, kind of outline to the listeners, why would there hypothetically be a reason to avoid seed oils? What are these popular claims out there?
So there are two primary mechanistic claims made about seed oils, and they're with regards to a specific polyunsaturated fatty acid in most of these seed oils called linoleic acid. Now, the two primary mechanistic arguments are one to do with lipid peroxidation, because polyunsaturated fats are uniquely vulnerable to lipid peroxidation. So that mechanism has to do with there's like a reactive oxygen species or some kind of reactant is basically tearing the fatty acid apart. And this can lead to degradation of cell membranes. It could lead to LDL oxidation, which supposedly increases the risk of cardiovascular disease. The other mechanism that is often talked about is interactions with the hypothalamus to increase like hyperphagia, like just overeating, to lead to the propensity to overeat. And that is through like reaction with cannabinoid receptors and whatnot. Even there are some hypotheses about like hypothalamic inflammation leading to hyperphagia, which has been demonstrated in rodent models, but not really persuasively in humans. There have been a lot of fatty acid substitution trials actually looking at, energy intake with different fatty acid proportions in the diet. So high polyunsaturated fat, high saturated fat, high monounsaturated fat. Well, those trials in humans almost universally come up null. But the hypothesis is that, we eat these toxic seed oils and the linoleic acid is causing all of this hypothalamic inflammation and interacting with cannabinoid receptors and literally giving us the munchies like we were smoking weed, when all we're really doing is just eating Doritos. It's a little bizarre because, like I said, like a lot of these things have been tested in humans, and it's interesting. So these two primary mechanisms, I could go through them. So lipid peroxidation by itself has a lot of implications according to this mechanistic hypothesis. So lipid peroxidation would increase LDL oxidation, which could increase the risk of cardiovascular disease. That's one hypothesis. Also, having a lot of toxic byproducts as a consequence of lipid peroxidation could increase the risk of cancer, which is another offshoot of this hypothesis. And honestly, like the lipid peroxidation thing pretty much bleeds into almost every single aspect of the anti-PUFA narrative. Like they chalk it up. Like if there's anything wrong with you, basically they chalk it up to polyunsaturated fat and linoleic acid in particular. Like the lipid peroxidation is going to lead to obesity. It's going to lead to fatty liver because LDL particles will oxidize before they even leave, or the VLDL particles will oxidize before they even leave the liver. So you'll predispose your liver to like intrahepatic triglyceride accumulation if you eat too much linoleic acid. Like I've heard all sorts of stories about what this fatty acid is supposed to do to us. And I've looked at almost every single aspect of this in the literature. And it's just, you can find supporting data for it in animal models, but that's where the supporting data ends. Because anytime you investigate this in humans, it just doesn't really hold up. So with regards to cardiovascular disease, I guess we'll just start with cardiovascular disease because that seems to be the one that people bring up the most. So the idea is you eat polyunsaturated fats, linoleic acid in particular, and it predisposes to lipid peroxidation, and it oxidizes LDL particles. Now, the thing is that we've tested this in humans, high linoleic acid diets versus low linoleic acid diets, high saturated fat diets versus high polyunsaturated fat diets. We've swapped the macros every possible way, and you even investigated individual fatty acids. And the interesting thing that comes up in the literature is that a high polyunsaturated fat diet will increase LDL oxidation, but so does a high saturated fat diet. A high monounsaturated fat diet doesn't, but a high saturated fat diet will, and a high polyunsaturated fat diet will. Now, the reason for this is because the polyunsaturated fats are uniquely vulnerable to lipid peroxidation, and that naturally will increase the tendency of LDL particles to oxidize. Obviously, like that just seems that seems to be logical, right? Now, a high saturated fat diet also does the same thing because sources of saturated fats typically don't contain many antioxidants because those sources of fat don't need antioxidants. There's no real purpose for the antioxidants to be there. Things like tropical oils, like coconut oil, for example, has a very low vitamin E content, very low polyphenol content, very high saturated fat content. So when you feed it in place of something like sunflower oil, you don't really see a difference in LDL oxidation because the lack of antioxidants also predisposes the LDL particle to oxidation. So it really just seems like if you're really concerned about this, just stick with olive oil, I guess, because it's low in saturated fat and polyunsaturated fat. There are actually a few of them. Hazelnut oil, macadamia nut oil, avocado oil, and olive oil are the 4 primary oils that are very, very high in monounsaturated fat, which doesn't seem to have these effects because monounsaturated fat is also resistant to lipid peroxidation the way saturated fat is, but it also seems to be delivered with a lot of antioxidants for some reason. So it seems to be the best middle ground is to have a high monounsaturated fat intake, or not a high intake, but to consume monounsaturated fat to the exclusion of polyunsaturated fat and saturated fat. Not that I actually think that polyunsaturated fat is bad. I think if you want to include it in your diet, that's fine. Yeah, so the mechanistic speculation that the hypothesis doesn't really pan out in humans, because when you do the exact opposite, the same thing happens. You feed high saturated fat, the same damn thing happens to the LDL particles. So the same thing with like lipid peroxidation. We've measured measures of like lipid peroxidation in humans. We've looked at isoprostanes. We've looked at glutathione reductase. We've looked at catalase. We've looked at malondialdehyde. We've looked at all sorts of different byproducts of lipid peroxidation in humans, and we find zip. There's just nothing there. There's no signal. Even when you do a substratification, like you do a subgroup analysis for the lowest polyunsaturated fat intakes, for the highest polyunsaturated fat intakes, there's no increase in any of these lipid peroxidation markers. Like there's literally just no signal there. Where you'd find a signal in animals, you just don't find a signal in humans. So that's like LDL oxidation, lipid peroxidation. Now, the second mechanism is the hyperphagia, hypothalamic inflammation, that kind of thing. And kind of something that ties them both together is looking at inflammation in particular. Like this has also been investigated. The lowest linoleic acid intakes to the highest linoleic acid intakes, the lowest polyunsaturated fat intakes to the highest polyunsaturated fat intakes, looking at markers of inflammation like high sensitivity C-reactive protein. We find nothing. There's nothing, no signal. And even if you do subgroup analyses just looking at the intervention diet relative to baseline, you find nothing. You look at the control diet relative to baseline, you find nothing. So there doesn't seem to be an effect of swapping out these different fatty acid subtypes on markers of inflammation. So the next hypothesis that I was going to talk about was like the one that leads to obesity. You know, it's like linoleic acid's going to give us the munchies. So this idea pans out in animals. If you feed them a high polyunsaturated fat diet, yeah, they eat more and they get obese. Doesn't happen in humans because we've tested this. There was one trial in particular, they used different fatty acid subtypes to they used different fatty acids to a varying saturation in muffins, and they got people to just eat to their heart's content with these different muffins, and there was no signal. Like there was no difference between any of the muffins. And I've heard some criticisms about that. It's like, well, you're giving them a hyperpalatable food, which is going to wash out any individual effect of each fatty acid because, well, the foods are hyperpalatable, so they're going to eat like as much as they can fit into their bodies anyway. And it's like, okay, maybe. But then how would you really explain like the obesity, how would you explain the obesity epidemic as a function of polyunsaturated fat if that were the case? Because the way that argument sounds, it sounds like even if you took all of our processed food and replaced all of the polyunsaturated fat with beef tallow, that we'd be in the same boat, right? So it's like, it seems really weird to isolate out polyunsaturated fat as the mechanism of action there when it really is just the palatability of the food that is the mechanism of action in this criticism. So yeah, it's been tested in humans. There doesn't seem to be any different, like any effect of appetite with these different fatty acids. Yeah, so that was my brief synopsis of the state of the literature so far.
It's it's odd, right? Like you mentioned in your intro that there just seems to be a lot of people that are scared of food to some degree, depending on
Hmm.
which side of the fence that they're on. And with that comes this desire to be able to blame a specific food or a nutrient for what's going on in public health, for this progressive deterioration that is just expected to get worse and worse based on every statistical model we have. And
Yeah.
sure, you know, our consumption of linoleic acid has increased over time, right? And that's a fact, but that doesn't necessarily correspond with the rising rates of cardiometabolic disease and obesity, right?
Yeah. I mean, the two, and it's not even the case that linoleic acid intake increased and then cardiovascular disease rates increased. Cardiovascular disease rates have come down by over 50% since the 1950s. And since the 1950s, linoleic acid consumption has actually gone up. So, like, the two are inversely associated. I don't think the association is causal, although it could be, because food formulation has favored polyunsaturated fat for a long time. And I mean, like, since the 50s, it really started to take off, because that's when we started to put the finger on saturated fat as a problematic nutrient for cardiovascular disease risk. So ever since then, polyunsaturated fat has, you know, become more prominent in the food supply. And I honestly, yeah, I probably think that it did have an effect on cardiovascular disease rates. You know, like, I had a conversation with somebody, and they were like, "You really think that, you know, we put all this polyunsaturated fat and all this linoleic acid in the French fry oil, and all of a sudden people just get less heart disease?" And I'm like, "Yeah, probably. Like, if you were to replace, like, beef tallow with it, then yeah, probably. It probably did have an effect. That's not to say that fries are a healthy food, but it probably did have an effect."
For sure. It seems like also part of the reason for bashing vegetable oils has to do with the degree of processing. And then furthermore, it might be put forth that, you know, our hunter-gatherer ancestors did not consume vegetable oils. And I, I'm not sure we should be using that population as our pet, putting them on a pedestal for health, but
Yeah.
but nonetheless, when what is the issue with this position? So why is it problematic to look to the diets of hunter gatherers and say, well, they didn't eat this, so therefore we in modern society, in the modern food environment, should not consume it either?
I think when it comes to public health, like, our epistemic standards have to be based in science. And if you're going to base your epistemic standards in science, looking back at hunter-gatherer diets and then looking at, you know, novel foods that have never been in the human diet before, I mean, you, in the absence of scientific experimentation or really, really, really robust observation, uh, we have to be agnostic about the health effects, at least in the long term, of these different foods. So when we're looking at hunter-gatherer populations, we always have to keep in mind that there is a phenomenon called antagonistic pleiotropy that could be in play. Antagonistic pleiotropy basically means something that can carry you to reproductive age might not be very productive for you later in life, because evolution only really cares about whether or not you reach reproductive age. After reproductive age, like, all bets are off pretty much. In fact, there's been some speculation in the literature that, as far as humans are concerned, there is very little selective pressure after the age of 40. And most of these chronic diseases happen, like, the onset of these chronic diseases happen after the age of 40. So that's an interesting thing to consider. So when we look at the diet of a hunter-gatherer, we also have to consider survivorship bias. Survivorship bias is a type of bias that occurs when we're looking at an incomplete sample due to survivorship, right? So when we're looking at a hunter-gatherer population, we see that they are robustly healthy. But the thing is that they have 50% child mortality rates, which means that the weaker half of their population is already dead. So how useful is it how useful is the observation? Oh man, look how healthy they are. Yeah, well, these people aren't us, because modern medicine rescues that other 50% in Western countries. Like, our child mortality rates are way below 1% in Western countries. So it's a little bizarre to use hunter-gatherers as like this avatar for like optimal, robust human health, when we don't even know if what we're observing in those populations even applies to us. You know, like, we can't say that a hunter-gatherer diet will make us robustly healthy because there is a robustly healthy population of hunter-gatherers that are eating that diet. It doesn't make any sense, because maybe they're robustly healthy because the weaker half of the population is already dead. You know, that's what survivorship bias is all about. And couple that with antagonistic pleiotropy, things like red meats are often, you know, posited as these health promoting foods that are ubiquitous in hunter-gatherer populations. The thing is that if evolution only really cares about reproductive age, and it doesn't really care about you after reproductive age, we can't really say that any of their foods are conducive to health in the long term. You know, especially something like red meat, which in the modern context, looking at modern populations, is almost universally associated with bad outcomes. So if we, like I said at the start, if we're going to base our epistemic standards in science and extremely robust observation, I think hunter-gatherer diets are probably some of the weakest evidence that you can look at, because where's the control? Like, where's the control for it? There is no control. We need science to tell us how to eat, and that's period, end of story.
Related to this topic, I've seen you put forth that the optimal diet for humans is probably heavily synthetic or artificially manipulated, which I think is particularly interesting because corresponding with this whole fascination with hunter-gatherers, it's this phenomenon of, well, just eat real food. If you just ate real food, things you could find in nature, obviously we would all be much healthier. But from your perspective, well, if we had some of these heavily synthetic foods, that might lead us to the best possible health. So kind of outline that take for the listeners and what you're thinking.
Yeah, for sure. So the idea, like, it might even be the case, it probably is the case, that with the foods that we currently have access to, a diet primarily centered around whole foods, you know, that checks all of the boxes for its health value in every way that we care about. Like, so it's lower in saturated fat, it has a higher unsaturated fat content. You know, you're choosing whole food carbohydrates over refined carbohydrates. Like, all of those things that we understand about a healthy diet are probably true with the foods that we currently have access to. But I've asked paleo people about this, and they do one of two things. They either agree or they disengage from the conversation entirely. So the argument goes, so you get them to accept that there is a maximal possible benefits to a whole foods diet, like a paleo diet, whatever avatar of the perfect diet that they have. Get them to bite the bullet that there is a maximal possible effect to the risk reductions. So there's headroom for improvement. And then ask them, how do we improve the health value of foods that already exist without artificial manipulation? And they either accept that and say, okay, yeah, synthetic diets probably are the future, but we don't have them yet, which I agree with, or they just disengage because the cognitive dissonance is too profound. So I think it's a pretty simple argument that if you want to improve the health value of food, you can't do it without manipulating it. Or if you can, I'm not aware of any method. Like, you'd have to do something to the food in order to improve its health value. So this has implications for things like synthetic meat, for example, which is becoming a very hot topic, you know, because it's actually right on the horizon. Synthetic meat is like right around the corner. This gives us the opportunity to do whatever the hell we want to it. Like, imagine having red meat that didn't have any of the health consequences, but pretty much the exact same, you know, texture and flavor profile that it has now. But you can actually dial up or down whatever characteristics the food has that might be positive or negative. Now, I just imagine the ability to just make food healthier with genetic resequencing or genetic programming, or not genetic programming, but like genetic manipulation. Uh, it's wonderful. Like, why shouldn't we be excited about this? But then the paleo people would be like, oh, but it's novel, so we can't trust it. Well, okay, then we're back to the original point about our epistemic standards. Like, okay, at baseline, we're agnostic about it until we have a good reason not to be. Now, I think if you took beef and replace all of the saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat, I'm pretty sure at a population level, you'd see a reduction in heart disease. I think the data is pretty clear that that would be a likely consequence. So there are some inferences that we can make that are probably pretty robust about the types of modifications that we can make to food. But ultimately, like this just appeal to nature fallacy that comes out of these people is just insane. Yeah, the optimal human diet probably has yet to be discovered, and it probably is really, really significantly artificially manipulated in one way or the other.
Yeah, I think I couldn't agree more, and I think it's fascinating. It's a simple and logical take, but at the same time, it's probably counterintuitive to
Yeah,
the average
absolutely.
consumer, right? Before we completely leave this focus on omega-6, I want to touch on the omega-3 to omega-6 ratio. So you did a fantastic job outlining the research and the mechanistic rationale behind why omega-6 might be bad for your health, but in reality, the human data just doesn't seem to support that whatsoever. And someone might take that information and accept it and go, okay, well, in isolation, omega-6 isn't necessarily bad for your health. But what about if the ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 is heavily skewed, right? So again, when we're kind of looking at these long-term changes in nutrition habits in the population and how public health is deteriorating, they might go, well, again, with the hunter gatherers, their omega-6 to omega-3 ratio might have been closer to 2 to 3 to 1. Whereas now in the average person, it's 15 plus to 1, perhaps.
Yeah.
So it kind of touch on the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio here. What is the premise for why it matters? And then does the science support that it actually does or does not matter?
So the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio was originally proposed as, it was a hypothetical, really. Like, at the time it was proposed, it wasn't really like linked to any negative health outcomes per se. It was just supposed to explain a potential problem with some mechanism. So if you take linoleic acid, which is a precursor for arachidonic acid, which is the omega-6 fatty acid that is biologically like required by your body, is the essential nutrient you actually need, and alpha linolenic acid, which converts to EPA and DHA in the body, which are the omega-3 fatty acids that you actually like physiologically need. Those two precursor fatty acids share the same desaturase enzyme, so it was proposed that it could be relevant to human health outcomes if you didn't have more linoleic acid than you had alpha linolenic acid, because they compete for the use of the same enzyme to elongate them and desaturate them. So it was proposed that if you crowded out the use of this enzyme with more omega-6, then you wouldn't have enough omega-3. And the literature is pretty clear that you want omega-3 in your diet to a greater degree than omega-6. I mean, most public health authorities haven't even put a number to a required arachidonic acid intake, for example. But most of them have numbers for EPA and DHA in particular. So it wasn't really linked to any health outcomes. And honestly, like, the rate of conversion is so ridiculously poor that I doubt it even matters for human health outcomes, keeping these fatty acids in a particular ratio. Because if you look at the way they behave in the human body, they're like vitamins, and they have like negative feedback loops between them, regardless of how much you have. So it probably doesn't even matter, as long as, like, if you're in the context of getting the pre-elongated fatty acids, it probably doesn't matter what ratio they're in. And a lot of the literature would seem to suggest that a high omega-6 to omega-3 ratio is just reflective of a low omega-3 intake, and then higher omega-3 intakes, even if the same amount of omega-6 is maintained, leads to better outcomes. And that is, it's pretty understandable why. I mean, you need omega-3, and having more is preferable to having less. But no, I don't think the ratio is actually very informative or even physiologically relevant. I think it was just an interesting idea that has kind of been grandfathered into the literature and never fully dispatched in any like concrete or comprehensive or systematic way, unfortunately. It's still just kind of floating around there as an idea, but I don't think it has any real validity to it at all.
Hey guys, Mike here. If you're interested in learning more about how to maximize your health, body composition, and performance, head over to hammerawayfitness.com, where you can sign up for coaching or even just schedule an hour consult with me to get some of your training and nutrition questions answered. Also, if you enjoyed this episode as much as I did and would like to further support the growth of the Muscle Memoirs podcast, you can give a donation to the link in the show notes, leave us a review, and or share this episode with your friends, whether that be dropping the link in a group chat or putting a screenshot in your Instagram story. I truly appreciate it. Yeah, it's something I see still every now and again. I feel like there was a paper in '06 or so. The lead author was Harris. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I think maybe I do. I'm
He-
really bad with authors.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll find it and link it in the show notes. But it did a great job of dismantling this theory. And again, this was back in, I know it was pre 2010. So again, I know not everyone keeps up to date with the literature, but it's just like it seems like a lot of these ideas. It's like man, like we knew that decades ago. I mean, we could even say that about polyunsaturated fat, right? I mean, everyone's bringing up this seed oil thing. Like, how long have we really known that it's just like this probably isn't something you need to worry about? And if anything, you should be emphasizing PUFA in your diet, right?
Yeah, we've known it for half a century. This is nothing new.
Well, kind of corresponding with these trends and wanting to, kind of change the narrative and bring up new ideas, and everything the government told you was completely wrong. We're here now to discuss saturated fat. We'll probably end up bringing up polyunsaturated fat again, but honing in on saturated fat. I think the average consumer will be familiar with the fact that the dietary guidelines for Americans does recommend limiting saturated fat to less than 10% of energy intake. However, according to Nutrition Twitter, this is just a complete conspiracy theory, Nick, and there is no hard data to support this recommendation. Should we be following what the government is telling us about nutrition, Nick? Is restricting our saturated fat intake to less than 10% of calories a good idea? What does the research have to say on this?
As a general heuristic, yeah, I think it's pretty sound, because if you look at the RCT data, which, I could bring up the epidemiology, but honestly, I don't even need to. We have trials on this. We have huge multi-year trials. Some of them have gone on for almost a decade. Like, we have a lot of data on this question. To the extent the substitution of saturated fat with any other thing reduces cholesterol, you will see likewise reductions in cardiovascular disease. Doesn't matter if you replace it with polyunsaturated fat. It doesn't matter if you replace it with like whole grain carbohydrate or monounsaturated fat. The degree to which the substitution will lower cholesterol will predict the cardiovascular disease outcomes. And that's because saturated fat has a unique propensity to downregulate LDL receptor activity in the liver. So when you consume a high saturated fat diet, you will be more likely to have a high LDL particle count and a high LDL cholesterol, because the LDL receptor activity in the liver is going down. You can't clear the particles as well as you could before. And the exact opposite happens when you consume polyunsaturated fat. So tying into what we were talking about earlier with the whole LDL oxidation thing, like eating polyunsaturated fat is going to increase your risk of heart disease. Well, even if I granted that LDL oxidation as a consequence of PUFA increased cardiovascular disease risk, it would not be the case that it would be enough to offset the benefits of polyunsaturated fat in lowering LDL particle number. So lowering LDL particle number or lowering LDL cholesterol clearly is a much bigger hammer than LDL oxidation, because when we feed polyunsaturated fat to the exclusion of saturated fat, cardiovascular disease rates go down. And you see the exact same relationship in the epidemiology. The degree to which a substitution will lower cholesterol will result in a greater reduction in cardiovascular disease rates. Based on my analysis, the cutoff, like the threshold of risk, is somewhere around 15, 16 grams a day, all the way up to 35 grams a day. So between 15 and 35 grams, risk increases. And then once you reach 35 grams, it really does seem like risk plateaus and doesn't go any higher the higher and higher you go in saturated fat intake. And this has been overlooked by a number of authors. Like pretty much every author who's published a meta-analysis looking at saturated fat consumption and coronary heart disease or cardiovascular disease endpoints in the literature have overlooked this threshold effect. And I actually took every one of these meta-analyses and I subgrouped them by intake, and you see the exact same damn thing in every single one of them. That when you stratify them by intake, you see that risk increases in this exact same intake range every single time, regardless of the meta-analysis. So like Zoe Harcombe's meta-analysis, for example, you take it apart, you do a subgroup analysis on it and stratify it by intake. Subgroup 2, statistically significant increase in risk. You take the Siri-Torino meta-analysis from 2010, you do the same thing. There's a borderline statistically significant increase in risk, but that's understandable considering that most of the risk ratios that they use controlled for serum cholesterol, you'd expect a closer to null effect with that meta-analysis. Zoe's was guilty of the same thing, but somehow the association survived that adjustment. Yeah, so the association is so profoundly robust. So we have RCT data supports it, epidemiology supports it, mechanistic data supports it. So we have like 300 metabolic ward trials doing fatty acid substitution and looking at lipid parameters. And the more saturated fat you feed, the worse your health, the worse the LDL cholesterol metric gets. So I don't know, how many tiers of the evidence hierarchy do we need to support this idea before people actually think, oh, hey, the government's maybe not lying to me. Like maybe there's something to this.
I believe Zoe's meta-analysis was published in the BMJ, and we kind of all know how that goes. Anything that's slightly contrary in the BMJ is like, oh, don't worry about the methods. We'll take it right in here.
It's worse than that. It's worse than that. It was published in the British Journal of Sports Goddamn Medicine. Like she couldn't even get it published to the BMJ, as biased as they are. She tried and failed, and she got it published to a sports medicine journal because they were the only ones who would take it.
Terrific. I think there was a recent Cochrane review as well on that showcased this threshold effect really well. The lead author was Hooper, I believe. Yeah. So
go on.
No, continue.
Oh yeah. So Hooper's analysis, basically she showed that she did a meta-regression analysis. And a meta-regression analysis, what it does is it looks at two variables that are controlled by a variable in the middle. So you can plug in whatever variable in the middle you want to see what predicts the effect. So the chain of causality is saturated fat, cholesterol, cardiovascular disease. And in place of cholesterol, you can swap out as many things as you want. You can swap out age, you can swap out fiber intake, you can swap out, whatever you want. But she did about 12 of these meta-regressions, and she found that the only one that was statistically significant was total cholesterol, meaning that saturated fat had a relationship with cardiovascular disease that was modulated by serum cholesterol. So serum cholesterol was the moderator variable that controlled the outcome. So that means that the extent to which the intervention lowers cholesterol, you can expect a reduction in cardiovascular disease rates. Now, her analysis also showed a few other things, like if you did a substratification for trials that only use polyunsaturated fat versus monounsaturated fat versus carbohydrates or even protein, the only one that actually showed the signal was polyunsaturated fat. And even if you do just a straight summation of all of the literature looking at just cardiovascular disease events, you see that substituting pretty much whatever the hell will lower, or substituting whatever the hell for saturated fat will lower cardiovascular disease rates. So it's a pretty robust relationship, but there are caveats to it, right? Like there are some caveats. For example, like whole dairy, like dairy that hasn't been like mechanically manipulated, like churned or otherwise homogenized or whatever, that dairy high in saturated fat doesn't seem to perturb blood lipids. And in the epidemiology, those types of dairy products are usually inversely associated with cardiovascular disease. So they could have some benefits for cardiovascular health that are unrelated to the saturated fat content. And because the saturated fat content in those foods doesn't seem to perturb blood lipids, there doesn't seem to be a clear association there as a function of saturated fat, but the foods generally lower cardiovascular disease. Another food that is kind of a caveat, probably to a greater degree than dairy, because dairy doesn't lower blood lipids, it just does nothing to blood lipids. So if you have high blood lipids, don't consume dairy thinking you're doing yourselves any favors, because you probably aren't. You'd probably be better swapping the dairy out with something that's more unsaturated to get a reduction in LDL. So the other one is chocolate, which has a high stearic acid content, which doesn't seem to have much of an effect on LDL. So like cocoa-based products, dark chocolate seems to be a net benefit in the literature, because when you feed these things to people, LDL actually goes down despite the high saturated fat content. But because there's only two caveats that I've been able to find on this, I think it still holds true that the public health recommendation to lower saturated fat to below 10% of calories is sound. Because like I said at the beginning, as a general heuristic, it's going to be sound, because it's going to lead people to cut out foods that are problematic, like fatty meat, perhaps even coconut oil, things that are really, really high in saturated fat. Like butter. Butter is probably one of the worst offenders, actually. And I can tell you an interesting story about butter if you wanted to hear it.
I do want to hear it, and I want to make sure that we get back to that. But
Yeah.
your most recent point there, I think, brings up a critical part of this discussion, that is the effect of replacement, right? So you mentioned there that replacing saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat, we're likely to see these improvements in cardiovascular risk factors, which is really important. And if someone were to restrict their saturated fat intake, they might be restricting these foods that are more or less problematic. But this also brings up the point of what they're replacing it with, right? So
Yeah.
perhaps then it's relevant to touch on the effect of replacing those foods with other nutrients that aren't polyunsaturated fat. So if we were to remove red meat and butter, but if we threw in some sort of refined grain or whatever else, what sorts of effects do we see then?
Pretty much no effects, which means that they're both terrible. So when you replace saturated fat with refined grains, you don't see a reduction in risk. The association is completely null. And given that saturated fat is the reference used to observe the reductions in risk for polyunsaturated fat, monounsaturated fat, and whole grain carbohydrate, we pretty much from there infer that the refined grain and sugar is like no better or no worse than saturated fat, and saturated fat is pretty bad. So that would lead me to believe that it's not actually like, it's not carbohydrate, which is like an argument that some people use. It's just that if you're eating a high saturated fat diet and a high refined grain diet, that's probably the worst possible scenario for the for. So and the substitution replacement doesn't really make a difference there in terms of actual disease outcomes.
And I've seen people use this point about how replacing saturated fat with refined grains, there doesn't seem to be some sort of effect there, but they use that as a justification for not demonizing saturated fat. They'll put forth,
Mm.
well, then there's nothing wrong with saturated fat if there's only a benefit when we replace it with PUFAs. Rather, PUFAs are just uniquely beneficial. So we should just worry about increasing that nutrient while restricting saturated fat. What is your take on that position?
So the Keyes equation is pretty much a way of predicting the effect that polyunsaturated fat and saturated fat will have on LDL, or total cholesterol, actually. So saturated fat will increase LDL in proportion. Okay, so it's difficult to actually put this into words. Like, saturated fat will increase LDL to the same degree that polyunsaturated fat will lower it. So if you replace all of your saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat, like, you'd be way over here. But if you kept your saturated fat intake the same and then piled on polyunsaturated fat, maybe you'd be over here. So if you had no saturated fat, you'd be in a better position, right? And the inverse is true. If you had only saturated fat, your LDL would be over here. And if you had just a little bit of polyunsaturated fat, you'd be closer to the middle, like you were in the other scenario. So I don't think it's true that saturated fat is a non-issue and we just need to increase polyunsaturated fat, because the Keyes equation is pretty predictive of health outcomes too. And it would lead us to believe that even if you had saturated fat at a fixed amount, there would be a benefit to taking saturated fat down even further. So I hope that answered your question. I wish I could have explained the Keyes equation better, but it's very it's difficult to put it into words exactly what it's showing. Yeah.
Regardless, I think the effect that you laid out makes complete sense. I think the listener will
Yeah.
pick it up. Basically, if we were to replace saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat, we're getting a larger reduction in these risk factors than we
Yeah.
were if we were to just increase PUFA in isolation, which is a really important point. You mentioned
Exactly.
how the data overall is very strong for these relationships, and we know this from a few different lines of evidence. In particular, right, the gold standard seems to be very robust and consistent. When we replace saturated fat with polyunsaturated fatty acids, we see these improvements. But I want to touch on the epidemiological evidence as well, and focus on that. You mentioned that still pretty consistent and robust, but I will see every now and again, when there is an epidemiological study which supports the narrative of saturated fat is completely fine and you don't need to worry about it. That seems to get thrown up on a pedestal, regardless of what the rest of the evidence has to say on the matter. I will see every now and again that there will be a paper showing that the effects of saturated fat are null. And while it might be a minority within the body of evidence, it will still be put out there as strong evidence because it supports a bias. You have a brilliant article discussing how this can occur in certain scenarios when we're looking at the saturated fat intake between different populations, and more or less when you combine a bunch of lackluster or suboptimal studies, or studies that are on one end or another of this threshold that we discussed, how that can really muddy the results and produce an effect that probably isn't replicable if we were to improve those methods a bit. Fill the listeners in here on why we can see these conflicts within the data.
So, like I was saying earlier, like, the meta-analyses that generally show null effects of saturated fat, or in epidemiology in particular, they just haven't done the subgroup analysis. Like, they actually haven't done their due diligence to actually go in there and subgroup by intake. And there's another problem is that on top of not doing the subgroup analysis and not actually selecting the cohorts that would be necessary to test the hypothesis, in the case of Zoe Harcombe, for example, like her paper was like, we're going to test the guidelines. She wasn't testing the guidelines. She threw a hodgepodge of epidemiological studies in there. And some of them, the ranges of saturated fat intake were all over the place. When in reality, like if you wanted to test the guidelines, you would only include cohorts that were eating on the lowest end below the threshold set in the guidelines to above the threshold set in the guidelines, and see if crossing that threshold increases risk. I did that stratification for her, and yeah, it increases risk going from the lowest to highest when it crosses the threshold set by the guidelines. She didn't test it, so I tested it for her, and her data actually supports the guidelines. Ha 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 ha. So that's like the first problem, is not doing the stratification, like not doing the stratification by intake. The second problem is using risk ratios that control for serum cholesterol. So when we were talking about Lee Hooper's meta-analysis, we were talking about moderator variables, so saturated fat, cholesterol, cardiovascular disease. Now, if you're doing an epidemiological study and you control for serum cholesterol, you've essentially removed the moderator variable from the equation, which will produce a null result. And I illustrate this on my blog too. I do a forest plot that just has risk ratios that control for serum cholesterol, and I have another one that uses risk ratios that don't. And you can see that the effect switches on and off like a light switch. Like when you're controlling for serum cholesterol, you see exactly null results, like perfectly null results. And then when you don't control for serum cholesterol, you see the effect of saturated fat on cardiovascular disease. So that's another problem with a lot of these meta-analyses that are out there, is that they're just not choosing the correct risk ratios, or they are highly vulnerable to over adjustment, which is another way to put it. And yeah, it just doesn't seem like a lot of critical thought has gone into this question in turn, like from the researchers who have actually decided to do meta-analyses on it, with the exception of Lee Hooper. Her meta-analysis is great. And there was another one, I think it was by Mosafarian. His was pretty good, if I remember correctly as well. Like a few of these meta-analyses have actually attempted to do like dose response curves and done meta-regressions and substratifications based on intake. And you see the effect in the exact same range in all circumstances. So it's pretty robust, and not taking into account those critical considerations, serum cholesterol and the range of intake, it's very easy to come up with null results. So where those null results have occurred, that is generally the reason why those null results have occurred.
Yeah. Overall, I guess my point with that question is to highlight this threshold effect that you mentioned, where when we get to a certain intake, increasing from there, there seems to be this dose response relationship, increasing the risk of cardiovascular disease events. And when you go past that, doesn't seem to be anything going on. It's just kind of stable. And the same goes for below that. So referencing your article again, if we look at the saturated fat intake in, for example, Japanese populations, when I've looked through a few of these studies, like it's very rare that you see an average intake above 20 grams per day. And you'll see numbers like 7 to 11 grams per day. Whereas when we look at the American and European populations, we're typically seeing, 30 plus grams per day at a minimum. And when you when you don't equate for this threshold, and we're just grouping together data that's on either side and not accounting for this middle, which is where this critical effect is observed, we can get these issues.
Yeah, and actually, if people want to go into this, like there's one paper that actually did a really interesting analysis based on country. I think it was Yamagishi 2013. It was one of the cohort studies investigating one of the Asian cohorts. And they did this really interesting stratification where they show like the Asian cohorts at the bottom with their range of saturated fat intake under 20 grams a day. And then they showed the American cohorts with their range of saturated fat intake, and it was between 15 to 35 grams a day, like my, magic threshold from my analysis. And then we see like the Finnish, who are like in ranges of saturated fat intake of like 60, 70, 80 grams a day. And their cardiovascular disease rates, you see the stepwise increase in cardiovascular disease rates the higher and higher up you go. But in the Finnish cohorts, there were more Finnish cohorts than any other in that particular analysis. You saw the plateau effect. You saw that you reach a maximal level of cardiovascular disease rates, and going higher and higher and higher in saturated fat doesn't do anything. This is called a sigmoidal relationship, right? You have a floor where there's no association with risk, and then there's an uptick, and then there's a ceiling with no association or risk going from the lowest to highest intakes on that ceiling, right? It's only in that middle range where we see the risk go up. And why it's sigmoidal in nature and not straight linear like it is in the saturated fat metabolic ward trials, I don't know. I have no idea, but I know it exists. I know it's there. I know the findings robust. I have no idea why it's not linear, but I don't need to know why it's not linear. The effect exists and it's robust.
The Finnish are an interesting population. You mentioned their exorbitant saturated fat intake. There was a recent meta-analysis on the effect of certain foods on LDL-C, and there was strong evidence for a strong effect of boiled coffee or unfiltered coffee raising LDL-C. Like it was grouped in with tropical oils and saturated fat. And I was like, what do you mean boiled coffee? And looking through the discussion, it's like, yeah, like basically the Finnish drink a lot of this, and we know for a fact it does because of the data we have on them.
Yeah, I was talking to Alan Flanagan about this, and he's like, their diet at one point was basically like unfiltered coffee and cheese dipped in butter. Like it was insane. Like, like their saturated fat intake was absolutely balls to the wall, and it was reflected in their cardiovascular disease rates. And this is actually a perfect place to talk about that butter story. So there was a Finnish public health intervention called the North Kalaria Project. And basically they told everybody in this one Finnish county to replace all of the saturated, like replace butter with like unsaturated fat. So it's like these people were just consuming so much butter that it was actually the most pragmatic thing to do from a public health intervention was just tell people to stop eating butter because it was going to have a dramatic effect. So they were like, just don't eat butter and replace it with like unsaturated fat or like carbohydrates or whatever. And between 1972 to 1985, like 50% of the 30% reduction in cardiovascular disease rates was attributable to reductions in serum cholesterol. Like it was a powerful public health intervention just to tell people to lay off the butter. Like, like it's crazy that something like that actually happened where, you know, we have population level health outcome and smoking didn't change and BMI got worse. So it's actually a really good control for saturated fat in isolation, or in this case, I guess, butter in isolation.
Beautiful.
It's hilarious.
While we're finishing up dissecting this topic, I guess the last thing I have on our agenda is it was recently mentioned to me again in the context of, you know, whether we should be demonizing saturated fat and the role of replacement. It was put forth that meta-analyses of RCTs on saturated fat do not show an effect on all-cause mortality. So basically, if we're seeing these increases in risk factors and potentially events, but in the grand scheme, the data might not be showing that there's an increase in all-cause mortality, how that might be further evidence for why saturated fat shouldn't be demonized. I'm not exactly familiar with the research that's being referred to. I asked for a citation. I didn't get it, but I don't know if you're aware of it, but your take on that.
Yeah. All-cause mortality is an extremely difficult endpoint to move the needle on because you need a profound amount of time. If you don't like, and you need to be measuring these endpoints, you need a profound amount of time, and it depends on the actual age range the population is in, right? So like, if you're only doing studies on people ages like 35 to 55, you might not see a huge effect on all-cause mortality, even if you do see a reduction in cardiovascular disease rates. Now, if you're doing a likewise study on a population between 65 and 85, you probably like reducing cardiovascular disease rates or some intervention might actually move the needle on all-cause mortality. It's just really it's just really difficult to move the needle for all-cause mortality. So it's not revelatory to me that a bunch of trials didn't see an effect on all-cause mortality. And in fact, it's surprising sometimes when we see effects on all-cause mortality. Like there have been a lot of meta-regressions looking at the effect of statin medication on all-cause mortality. And it really does look like over a very short amount of time, dramatically lowering LDL cholesterol and ApoB with a statin medication lowers all-cause mortality to a statistically significant degree. And that finding is actually surprising to me, considering how difficult it is to actually find a signal with all-cause mortality. So no, it doesn't shock me that these trials don't come up with any all-cause mortality differences. And ultimately, I find it to be a really weird hill to die on if anybody is at all familiar with like population statistics and whatnot.
I really do enjoy that breakdown. I love the nuance you're providing to this discussion. I know the listeners are going to enjoy it as well. Nick, that is all I have for you today. This has been absolutely wonderful. For the listeners who want to go and support you, learn more about you, where can we point them towards?
So most of my activity is happening on Twitter. So that's just, my handle is _Nutrivore, and that's my Twitter handle. I'm also on Instagram at _Nutrivore. You can catch me on my site, the-nutrivore.com. Where else can I be found? Oh, I have a Patreon. It's the Nutrivore, one word. So patreon.com/the-Nutrivore. If you like this sort of content, I have like dozens and dozens of articles on subjects similar to this in my Patreon. It's like patron exclusive content. I also have a lot of videos on Patreon, discussions actually quite a bit like this. So if this is content that you enjoy, consider pledging toward me. All it does is make it easier for me to produce more content like this. But yeah, I think that's about it.
And I'll be sure to throw all of those links in the show notes. Nick, last time you were on, we basically had a comprehensive discussion about the nutrient density cheat sheet, but I believe that evolved into the NutriDex. Am I correct?
Yeah. So a nutrient density cheat sheet was just like really long and cumbersome. So I just rebranded it as the NutriDex just to make it very, very concise. And I think it's a bit more of a snazzy name. And since the last time we talked, it's gone over like a few different overhauls. So like it's way more comprehensive than it was before. It offers a lot more information than it did before. And there are a lot more tools to use on it. Yeah. So if you wanted a copy of it, it's also on my site. So the-nutra-dex. There's a link to it on my Twitter as well, if you want to find a direct link to it. But yeah, it's a really comprehensive nutrition ranking tool that is designed to allow people to select foods based on philosophical views and personal dietary goals. So rather than telling you these are the foods that you should eat, it asks what are your goals, and then it gives you a stratification of foods that are more or less conducive to the goals that you are trying to meet.
And it is a super cool resource, I must say. I encourage everyone to check it out, along with all of other aspects of Nick's work. He's on the grind on a daily basis on Twitter, putting these ridiculous nutrition statements, battling all of these fallacies going on with our industry right now, and ultimately making things simple for the consumer. In my opinion, I think people try to overcomplicate this and change the basics, but the basics have stood the test of time for a reason, right? So you're doing excellent work, Nick, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you. And thank you very much for having me on. It was great talking to you again.
My pleasure, man. That does it for another episode of the Muscle Memoirs podcast. Thank you so much for listening, everyone.